Hello there. How is the weather in your part of the world tonight? I hope you're sitting somewhere warm, perhaps with a hot cup of coffee in hand, letting the day's worries settle like dust. Tell me, have you ever carried a silence so heavy that it felt louder than any scream? A memory of a mistake that followed you, not like a shadow, but like a scar on your soul. We often run to the ends of the earth to escape our past, only to find it waiting for us in the fog. Tonight, we travel to the cold, rocky coast of Maine. We meet a man named Declan, a diver who thought he went there just to survey a broken ship called the Northern Star. But instead, he found himself facing the broken pieces of his own life. And he wasn't alone. Beside him walked Barnaby, a gentle giant of a dog, a creature born for the water, who for the first time in his life refused to swim. Why would a dog deny his own nature? Because sometimes our four-legged friends see the dangers we are too blind or too proud to admit. This is a story about human greed, deep regret, and the quiet, unwavering loyalty that pulls us back from the edge. Welcome to the family. If you are ready to listen, please pull up a chair and subscribe. Let's find the light in the fog together. The fog at Stony Cove was not a weather event. It felt like a living thing, a thick, cold blanket that smothered the world in gray. Declan Reed sat in the driver's seat of his modified Ford F-250, the engine ticking as it cooled. Through the windshield, the wipers had cleared 2 arches of visibility, framing the reason he had driven 6 hours north to the jagged edge of Maine. There she was, the Northern Star. She did not look like a ship anymore. Broken in 2 by a winter storm 3 months prior, the freighter looked like a fractured tombstone jutting out of the Atlantic. The bow pointed sharply toward the sky, while the stern was half submerged, lost in the churning gray water. It was a desolate, lonely sight that made an old ache flare up in Declan's chest, a phantom pain from a life he had left behind years ago. "Okay, boy, let us stretch our legs," Declan murmured. He opened the door, and the smell of the ocean hit him. It was cold, briny, and sharp. A moment later, the passenger door opened, and a massive black shape descended with surprising grace. Barnaby, a 5-year-old Newfoundland, landed on the wet gravel. He was a giant of a dog, weighing nearly 170 pounds, with a coat as dark as midnight and a heart that was famously gentle. Barnaby shook his massive head, his tags jingling softly, sending a spray of drool into the mist. He looked up at Declan with soulful, drooping brown eyes, waiting for a command. Declan walked to the edge of the rocky beach, his boots crunching on the stones. He stopped and listened. That was when he noticed it. The silence. The coast of Maine in late autumn should have been a cacophony. There should have been the shrieking of seagulls fighting over crabs. There should have been the splashing of cormorants diving for fish. But there was nothing. No birds. No scuttling crabs. Just the rhythmic, heavy slap of the water against the rocks and the wind whistling through the rusted metal of the wreck. It was a dead silence, heavy and unnatural. It unnerved him. He needed to break the tension. He looked down at the shoreline. A piece of driftwood, smoothed by the sea, lay near his boot. He picked it up, weighing it in his hand. Barnaby watched him, his tail giving a slow, heavy wag. This was their ritual. Newfoundlands were born for the water. They had webbed feet and a double coat, designed to withstand freezing temperatures. For Barnaby, the ocean was not just an environment, it was a calling. "Go get it, Barnaby," Declan said, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet air. He threw the wood high. It arched through the fog and landed with a wet splash in the shallows, just a few feet from the shore. Barnaby launched himself forward. He was a blur of black fur, powerful muscles propelling him over the slick rocks. He looked like a black bear charging into battle. But then, the impossible happened. Just as his front paws were about to hit the surf, Barnaby slammed on the brakes. His heavy claws dug into the wet sand, skidding to a halt, inches from the foam. "Barnaby," Declan called out, confused. The dog did not retrieve the wood. Instead, he recoiled violently. He sneezed, a harsh, explosive sound that shook his entire body. He shook his head wildly, then lowered his muzzle to his front paws, rubbing his nose frantically against his legs. He acted as if he had just inhaled pepper spray. He sneezed again, a sound of pure irritation and distress, and then backed away. He turned his broad back to the ocean, tail tucked between his legs, and walked quickly back toward the truck, head low. Declan stood frozen, his hand still raised. He had never seen a Newfoundland refuse water. It was against their very DNA. He walked over to the dog, who was now sitting by the rear tire, looking miserable. Declan checked the dog's paws and nose. There were no cuts, no visible injuries, but the dog's eyes were filled with a deep, instinctual worry. "It is okay, buddy. Maybe the water is too cold even for you today," Declan said softly, though he knew that was a lie. Nothing was too cold for a Newfoundland. The afternoon wore on, and the light began to fade, turning the gray fog into a deep charcoal. The tide began to turn. As the water rose, pushing higher up the beach and flooding the broken hull of the Northern Star, the sound began. It started as a low vibration that Declan could feel in the soles of his boots. Then, it grew into an audible noise. It was not the screech of metal on metal. It was deeper, hollower. "Hoo!" The sound resonated across the empty bay. It sounded like a massive, mournful exhale, a long, dying sigh escaping from the crushed throat of the ship. It was the sound of air being forced out of a trapped space by the rising water, but to the human ear, it sounded like grief. Declan shivered, zipping his jacket higher. He looked down for Barnaby, seeking the comfort of his solid presence, but the dog was gone. "Barnaby?" He looked around. The dog was not by his side. Declan knelt and looked under the truck. There, squeezed into the tight space, between the cold mud and the chassis, was Barnaby. The giant dog was pressed flat against the ground, his eyes wide and terrified, trembling as the ship continued its mournful, wailing song. The silence of the birds, the refusal to swim, and now this terror. Declan looked out at the dark silhouette of the wreck. The locals called it a tragedy, but as the strange howl cut through the night, Declan felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. This was not just a shipwreck. It was a warning. The following morning, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the gray, weathered bones of the town of Stony Cove. Declan steered his heavy truck into the gravel lot of Mavis's Stop and Shop, the only gas station and general store for 20 miles. He needed diesel for the compressor and coffee for himself, in that order. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. The air inside smelled of old paper and floor wax. Behind the counter stood a woman who looked as durable as the granite cliffs outside. This was Mavis. Her hair was a steel gray bun, and her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "You are the fellow out by the wreck," Mavis stated, not asking a question. She placed his coffee on the counter with a deliberate thud. "I am," Declan replied, counting out cash. "Just a survey job." Mavis leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Survey or not, you best be quick about it. Mercer Thorne does not like strangers poking around his salvage yard, and he likes it even less when they poke around that ship. He considers anything that washes up in this bay his property." Declan paused, meeting her gaze. "Is he the law around here?" Mavis let out a dry, humorless laugh. In Stony Cove, Mercer is the weather. You do not fight the weather, son. You batten down the hatches and wait for it to pass. Watch your back. Declan thanked her and left, the warning sitting heavy in his gut. He needed to speak to this Mercer Thorne. If the man claimed rights to the wreck, Declan needed to gauge how much resistance he would face. He drove to the edge of town, where a rusted chain-link fence marked the boundary of Mercer's salvage and scrap. Piles of twisted metal rose like jagged mountains against the skyline. Declan parked and stepped out. Barnaby hopped down beside him, sticking close to Declan's leg. A man emerged from a corrugated metal shed. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, wearing greasy coveralls. This was Mercer Thorne. He wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowing as he sized Declan up. "You are trespassing," Mercer rumbled, his voice like gravel in a mixer. "I am Declan Reed. I am handling the insurance survey on the Northern Star. Just letting you know, I will be diving the site for a few days." Mercer threw the rag onto an oil drum. He walked closer, invading Declan's personal space. The air suddenly felt charged with violence. "No, you will not," Mercer said. "That water is full of riptides. It is a graveyard. I have lost good men out there. You pack up your truck, write your little report, saying it is a total loss, and you go back to wherever you came from. Today." He took another step forward, his chest almost bumping Declan. It was a physical intimidation tactic, plain and simple. Suddenly, the space between them vanished. Barnaby did not bark. He did not growl. He simply stepped forward. One moment he was by Declan's side, and the next, he was a black wall of fur and muscle planted firmly between the two men. The Newfoundland stood at his full height, his massive head level with Mercer's chest. He didn't bare his teeth. He just stared at Mercer with a cold, unblinking intensity. It was the look of a guardian who had drawn a line in the sand. Mercer froze. He looked down at the 170-pound animal, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine unease crossed his face. He took a slow step back. "Keep your beast on a leash," Mercer spat, pointing a thick finger at Declan. That was when Declan saw it. On the back of Mercer's right hand, the skin was mottled and discolored. It was not the jagged white line of a cut or the red pucker of a heat burn. It was a patch of pitted, yellowish scarring that looked like melted wax. Declan had spent 20 years around industrial sites. He knew what a chemical burn looked like. "We will be gone soon enough," Declan said evenly, his hand resting on Barnaby's neck. He turned and walked back to the truck, his mind racing. Mercer was not worried about safety. He was hiding something. They drove back toward the cove in silence. Halfway there, the road curved near a rocky inlet. Barnaby, who had been resting his head on the windowsill, suddenly sat bolt upright. He let out a sharp, urgent whine and pawed at the door panel. Declan pulled over. "What is it, boy?" Barnaby leaped out and scrambled down the embankment toward the tide line. Declan followed, sliding on the loose rocks. The dog stopped a few feet from a dark shape lying in the seaweed. He looked back at Declan, his tail low, refusing to get closer. It was a harbor seal. It was dead. Declan approached carefully, covering his nose and mouth with his collar. The animal had not been killed by a predator. There were no bite marks. Instead, its skin was horrifyingly wrong. Patches of fur were missing, and the skin beneath was ulcerated and weeping, covered in a strange yellowish slime. It looked exactly like the scar on Mercer's hand, but far worse. Declan stared at the poor creature, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was not nature. This was poison. He looked out at the Northern Star, looming in the distance. The pieces clicked together. The silence of the bay, Barnaby's refusal to swim, the burn on Mercer's hand, and now this, polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. The ship was not just broken, it was bleeding poison into the ocean, and Mercer knew it. He had likely been paid to hide it. Declan looked down at Barnaby, who was watching him with sad, knowing eyes. "You were right," Declan whispered, the wind stealing his words. "It is toxic. If he left now, the evidence would disappear. The ocean would wash it away, and Mercer would win." Declan looked at his hands. They were shaking, but not from cold. He needed proof, irrefutable though, physical proof, from inside the hull. He had to dive. Declan backed the rig, as close to the water's edge as he dared. The tires crunched over the loose shale, settling into the gravel with a heavy groan of the suspension. The fog was thicker now, rolling in off the Atlantic like the smoke from a dying fire, carrying with it the faint, acrid scent of something that did not belong in nature. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 20 years trusting his life to equipment. First, he climbed into the truck bed and deployed the Starlink dish. The small rectangular device hummed to life, searching the gray sky for a signal. In this dead zone, it was his only tether to the outside world, his only way to upload the evidence he hoped to find. Next came the communication box. It was a rugged yellow case, housing the radio system that would connect his helmet to the surface. Usually, a dive tender would be here to man the radio, but today, Declan was alone. He flipped a switch marked Open Mic. A burst of static crackled from the speaker, followed by the amplified sound of the wind and the waves. Now, even while he was underwater, the speaker would broadcast the sounds of the shore into his helmet. If Mercer returned, Declan would hear him. He jumped down from the truck bed and reached for his dry suit hanging in the locker. The heavy black vulcanized rubber smelled of talc and neoprene. Barnaby, who had been pacing anxiously by the rear tire, stopped dead. The Newfoundland knew what the suit meant. For 5 years, the sight of that black rubber had been a trigger for joy, a signal that they were going to work in the water together. But today, the sight of the suit seemed to terrify him. Barnaby let out a low, vibrating sound from deep within his chest, a noise of pure distress. As Declan unrolled the yellow umbilical hose, the lifeline that would supply him with air from the surface compressor, Barnaby made his move. The dog did not run away. Instead, he lunged forward. With a heavy thud, the 170-pound animal collapsed directly on top of the coiled air hose. He flattened his massive body against the rubber line, effectively pinning it to the ground. "Barnaby, move," Declan said, his voice firm but strained. The dog did not budge. He looked up at Declan, his dark eyes wide and pleading. A clear, thin fluid was running from his nose, dripping onto his paws. The chemical vapors rising from the surf were irritating his sensitive mucous membranes, burning him in a way Declan could barely detect. Declan reached down to pull the hose free, but Barnaby shifted his weight, making himself an immovable object. Then, he did something that broke Declan's heart. The giant dog wrapped his front paws around Declan's leg and pressed his forehead against Declan's shin, letting out a sharp, high-pitched cry that cut through the fog. He wasn't being disobedient. He was begging. He was a living barrier, using the only tool he had, his massive size, to keep the person he loved from entering the poison. Declan froze. He felt the tremors running through the dog's body. The fear radiating from Barnaby was palpable. It would have been so easy to stop, to pack up the truck and drive away from this cursed bay. But then Declan thought of the dead seal with its corroded skin. He thought of the scars on Mercer's hand. He thought of the silence where the seagulls should be. Slowly, Declan knelt in the wet gravel. He placed his hands on either side of Barnaby's broad head. The dog licked his hands frantically, trying to clean away the invisible danger. "I know, buddy. I know it is bad," Declan whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "You are a good boy. You are the best boy." He gently but firmly took Barnaby's paws and moved them away from his leg. He stood up, towering over the dog. Barnaby looked up, his tail still, waiting for a sign that they were leaving. "I have to do this, Barnaby," Declan said, his tone shifting from comfort to resolve. He looked toward the invisible horizon, where the northern star lay waiting. "Or he gets away with it. And if he gets away with it, this whole bay dies." Declan did not wait to reach the water to protect himself. The air here was already toxic enough to make the dog sick. He picked up his helmet, a heavy yellow commercial dive helmet with a locking neck dam. He pulled the latex neck seal over his head, right there on the beach. With a series of metallic clicks, he locked the helmet into place. The world outside was instantly muffled. All he could hear was the rhythmic hiss of his own breathing and the static from the open mic on the truck bed. He was sealed in. He was ready to descend into the abyss, leaving his guardian behind on the gray, lonely shore. The water closed over Declan's helmet, instantly extinguishing the gray world of Stony Cove. In its place was a suffocating, murky green twilight. Visibility was less than 3 feet. The ocean here did not feel vast. It felt heavy, pressing in against his dry suit with the weight of 1,000,000 cold tons. Declan kicked his fins, descending slowly along the rusted flank of the northern star. His breathing was the only sound, a mechanical rhythm of inhalation and exhaust that echoed loudly inside his helmet. Hiss, click, now hiss. He reached the section of the hull where the anomaly lay. Through the gloom, his dive light cut a sharp beam, illuminating particles of silt that hung suspended like dust in an abandoned room. There it was, hatch number 4. It was a monstrosity of engineering. The edges were thick with globs of hasty amateur welding, sealing what should have been an access point into a tomb. Declan unclipped the brocothermal cutting torch from his utility belt. He needed to be fast. He needed to cut a hole, get the sample, and get out before the cold, or the memories seeped in too deep. He jammed the tip of the cutting rod against the steel plate and squeezed the oxygen lever. Ignition. A blinding white star erupted in the darkness, boiling the seawater instantly. But it was not the light that broke him. It was the sound. As the oxygen tore through the steel, it created a violent, high-pitched screeching noise. It was an aggressive, tearing hiss that vibrated through the water and straight into Declan's skull. In an instant, the murky water of 2025 vanished. Declan was back in the darkness of 2015. He was not cutting a hatch. He was watching a kinked air hose flail wildly. He heard the same terrible hiss of escaping life. He saw the bubbles. Oh no, not here, not now. The bubbles from his torch swirled chaotically in front of his faceplate. For a terrifying second, the random patterns of foam and light coalesced into a shape, a face, pale, wide-eyed, and screaming in silence. "Danny!" Declan gasped. The air in his helmet suddenly felt thin, insufficient. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The panic attack hit him with the force of a physical blow. His lungs seized. He sucked in air, but it felt like he was breathing through a straw. Hyperventilation set in. His vision began to tunnel, the edges turning black. The rational part of his brain screamed that he was safe, but the lizard brain, the part ruled by trauma, screamed that he was dying. He dropped the torch. His hands flew up, clawing at the locking collar of his helmet. He had to get it off. He had to breathe. If he opened his helmet at this depth, he would drown instantly. But the panic did not care. He was drowning in his own fear. On the shore, inside the bed of the pickup truck, the open microphone picked up the horrifying sound of Declan's distress. It wasn't words, but the jagged, desperate gasps of a man fighting for air. Barnaby heard it. The Newfoundland did not hesitate. He did not understand the technology, but he understood the sound of a packmate in trouble. He leaped up, placing his massive paws on the tailgate, and thrust his muzzle right against the yellow plastic of the communication box speaker. He unleashed a bark. It was not a warning or a threat. It was a command. Underwater, the sound arrived. Boom. The noise resonated through Declan's headset. It was deep, distorted by the transmission, and utterly powerful. Boom, boom. It did not sound like a machine. It sounded like a heartbeat. A giant, steady, living heartbeat, echoing in the abyss. Declan froze, his hands gripping the rim of his helmet. The hallucination of Danny's face shattered. The sound cut through the panic, like a lighthouse beam through fog. Boom. It was Barnaby. The dog was calling him back. Declan closed his eyes. He focused entirely on the rhythm of the bark. Inhale on the boom. Exhale on the silence. Boom. Inhale. Boom. Exhale. Slowly, the black edges of his vision receded. The crushing weight on his chest lifted. The hissing of the torch was just noise again, not a memory. He was Declan Reed. He was alive. And Barnaby was waiting. "I'm okay, buddy," Declan whispered, his voice trembling. "I am okay." He reached down and retrieved the torch. His hands were steady now. With a renewed, cold focus, he finished the cut. The steel plate gave way, falling inward. Immediately, a plume of thick black sludge billowed out from the hole, darker than the surrounding water. It swirled around him, oily and vile. Declan unclipped a sample vial and held it into the stream. The black liquid filled the container. He had it, the proof of the poison. He sealed the vial, clipped it to his belt, and signaled the start of his ascent. He was leaving the darkness behind, rising toward the gray light, where his savior stood guard. Declan broke the surface of the water, gasping as the fresh air rushed into his lungs. He dragged his heavy body up the shallow slope of the beach, his legs trembling from the adrenaline crash. He reached up to unlock his helmet, but movement on the shore made him freeze. He was not alone. Two men stood by his truck. It was Mercer Thorne and his henchman, Jeb. They were armed with heavy iron crowbars. Jeb was already winding up to swing at the yellow communication box, intending to smash the hard drives and sever the air hose that had kept Declan alive. "Hey!" Declan shouted, his voice muffled and weak through the helmet. Mercer turned, a sneer twisting his scarred face. He raised his own weapon, stepping toward the umbilical line. They were going to bury the evidence, and they did not care if Declan was buried with it. But they had forgotten the Guardian. From the shadow of the truck bed, a low, rumbling growl vibrated through the air, sounding like a coming earthquake. Barnaby appeared on the tailgate. He was no longer the cowering animal who feared the water. He was a 170-pound force of nature, and his pack was threatened. With a roar that echoed off the cliff walls, Barnaby launched himself into the air. He hit Mercer in the chest with the force of a battering ram. The large man was lifted off his feet and slammed violently into the wet sand. Before Mercer could draw a breath, Barnaby was on top of him, his massive paws pinning Mercer's shoulders to the ground. The dog lowered his face inches from Mercer's throat, baring white teeth, a guttural snarl rumbling in his chest. Jeb dropped his crowbar and scrambled backward, terrified by the black demon that had erupted from the truck. "Barnaby, hold!" Declan commanded, his voice cracking. He ripped his helmet off and stumbled up the beach, water streaming from his dry suit. He walked past the terrified Jeb and stood over Mercer, who was paralyzed by the weight of the furious Newfoundland. "Call him off," Mercer screamed, his eyes wide with terror. Declan did not rush. He reached into his belt and held up the vial of black sludge. Then he pointed to the rectangular white dish mounted on the roof of his truck. "You are too late, Mercer," Declan said, his voice cold and steady. "That is a Starlink satellite uplink. My helmet camera has been live streaming to the cloud for the last 20 minutes. The EPA, the state police, and Officer Kincaid have already seen everything. They saw the hatch, they saw the poison, and they saw you trying to destroy the evidence." The fight drained out of Mercer instantly. He slumped into the sand, defeated not by a man, but by technology and a dog he had underestimated. In the distance, the wailing siren of a police cruiser cut through the fog, getting louder with every second. Declan looked at his dog. "That is enough, Barnaby. Leave it." Barnaby let out one final warning huff against Mercer's face, then stepped back. He trotted over to Declan, his demeanor shifting instantly from aggression to concern. Declan fell to his knees in the gravel, his strength finally failing him. He wrapped his arms around Barnaby's thick, wet neck. He pressed his forehead against the dog's broad, furry forehead, closing his eyes. He could feel the dog's heart pounding, a strong, steady rhythm against his chest. "You saved me," Declan whispered, tears mixing with the salt water on his face. "You brought me back. Thank you, buddy." Barnaby licked the side of Declan's face, his tail giving a slow, heavy thump against the ground. The nightmare was over. 1 year later, the summer sun shone brilliantly over Stony Cove, turning the water a dazzling deep blue. The gray fog was gone, banished by the warmth of July. The rusting hulk of the Northern Star was gone too, removed piece by piece by the salvage barges that had spent months cleaning the bay. Declan stood on the shoreline, wearing a t-shirt and shorts, looking out at the water. The silence of death was replaced by the crying of gulls and the splashing of fish. The air smelled sweet and salty, with no trace of the acrid chemical burn that had haunted this place. He looked down. Barnaby sat beside him, his black coat shining in the sun. The dog looked out at the water, his ears perked, his body vibrating with energy. There was no sneezing, no runny nose, no fear. "Ready?" Declan asked. He pulled a bright orange bumper toy from his pocket and threw it high into the air. It darted over the water and splashed down 20 yards out. This time, there was no hesitation. Barnaby launched himself from the rocks. He hit the water with a massive splash, diving in with pure, unadulterated joy. His powerful webbed paws churned the water as he swam, a black otter in his natural element. He grabbed the toy, turned, and paddled back, his tail acting as a rudder behind him. Declan watched him, a smile breaking across his face. The poison was gone. The ghosts were quiet, and the giant had returned to the sea. Sometimes, the truest guides in life do not speak a single word. They simply stand by our side, anchoring us when the tides of the past try to pull us under. Barnaby teaches us that loyalty is the quietest yet strongest force in the world. If his courage touched your heart today, we would be honored to have you join our family by subscribing and sharing this story with a friend. We read every thought you leave in the comments. To continue this journey with us, please click the new story appearing on your screen now and let us travel together a little longer.